Today, we're going to be talking about swallowing in two different contexts. We will be talking about it in the point of view of presenting to a cognitively intact adult patient and to a medical student. So, just a quick overview. Today, we'll go through a brief introduction, followed by an explanation of swallowing with diagrams, another explanation of swallowing with diagrams, and then a list of references used to complete this project. Introduction. So today we're going to be discussing swallowing in two different concepts, one with an adult patient and the second with a medical student. And just to discuss this project was completed by Ruth Rodriguez, myself, Kim Reed, and Melissa Levano. So let's talk swallowing. Swallowing consists of four different stages. So your first stage is known as your oral preparatory stage. And in this stage, this is when the food first goes into your mouth and where chewing happens. So the goal here is to break the food down into smaller pieces within the mouth. And when these pieces are broken down, the glands within your mouth are going to mix it with saliva, and this is going to form what's known as a bolus, which is basically just a ball of food. Um, in this stage, towards the end, the tongue is going to start to move, which is like a transition into our next stage, but also because you want to start positioning the food for travel. And so here is just a quick look at what this stage would look like. So as you can see, this ball of food has just entered the mouth, and then we get a brief explanation, and the tongue is pushing up against the hard palate to move the bolus. So this is kind of covering our stages 1 and 2, which we will get more into in our next slide. So stage 2, here is when the tongue is actually elevating against the hard palate because we are transitioning our food, and this is known as the propulsive stage. So different articulators that you have, which is just like your tongue, this is what's forming your food into that ball shape in order to be moved to your throat to start the actual process of swallowing itself. So once the shape is formed, then this is going to start. And just to mention, both stage 1 and 2 are voluntary, which means that you are conscious and controlling what is happening in these stages. And the tongue is what allows the food to be pushed back. And once the food reaches the back of the oral cavity, we transition to our next stage. So the next stage in the swallowing process would be stage 3, and this is going to be the pharyngeal stage. So this is where you're going to take the food from the oral cavity to your pharynx. Um, and this involves different parts of your body, like your throat, your soft and hard palate, your nasal cavity, your epiglottis. All of these are working together simultaneously or at different times to aid in the swallowing process. And so, in terms of your epiglottis, this is a piece of cartilage. And so, we have to remember that when we're swallowing, we don't want things to go down the wrong pipe. We want everything to go where it's supposed to be just to avoid any complications like choking. So, the epiglottis, which is kind of like a leaf shape, in your throat is going to cover your windpipe. And this again happens because we don't want any choking. And throughout this process, your muscles will be moving in an in and out motion. So this is occurring because the food is being constricted and then released in order to move downwards from the pharynx, with the goal being that it'll move into the esophagus. And your esophagus is this long tube that's connecting all the way to your stomach, and that's how our food is digested or swallowed. So here we have another little picture. As you can see, your epiglottis is covering because we do not want any food or liquid in the lungs. And we have our piece of food here, and it is traveling down to go to the pharynx. And the soft palate is going to flip back, and it's going to close your nasal cavity so that food or liquid does not travel in there either. So then our last stage, as you can see by the diagram, is when food will have reached the esophagus. So here it's going to start moving towards your stomach, and different nerves like the vagus nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, just different cranial nerves are all working together with your muscles during this time to aid in this movement. And also our esophagus, different parts of the esophagus, like the sphincters, are going to open and close in response to pressure levels to allow the food to pass correctly. So again, think about that in and out, constricting and then releasing movement that is occurring in order for the ball of food or the bolus to travel down correctly. And here we just have a quick look at all the phases next to each other. So phase 1 and 2, the oral preparatory and propulsive stage. So this is when the food first goes in your mouth and is being moved to the back, are grouped together. And then our next stage, which is our pharyngeal stage, this is when your food is first entering your pharynx. And from here, we go to our last stage, which is our esophageal stage, where food is entering your esophagus. So once it is in your esophagus, main goal to go down to your stomach to complete the swallowing process. Okay, now we're going to take another quick look at swallowing. This one is going to be with a little more medical terminology. So again, we have 4 stages in the swallowing process. We have our oral preparatory stage, our propulsive stage, our pharyngeal stage, and our esophageal stage. Let's talk stages. So our oral preparatory stage is our first stage, and this is voluntary, meaning that we have control. It is a conscious action that we are performing. So here the food will enter the oral cavity, and your lips are going to act as a seal to hold it inside. So when the seal cannot form correctly, this is when you see leakage, spillage of food and liquid coming out when you're chewing or drinking something. But once the seal is formed and the food is inside, mastication will occur. Mastication is just another word for chewing. And again, your salivary glands are going to mix saliva into the bolus in order for it to form. And your tongue, which is a major articulator for swallowing, is going to begin to position the bolus for movement. So this is going to occur because your tongue is elevating. In order to push the bolus back. And again, your soft palate elevates because we want to protect our nasal cavity, and our epiglottis will cover a flap to protect the lungs. Then we are also going into the propulsive stage, which is the second stage in swallowing. Here, this is also a voluntary stage, meaning that it is conscious. We do have control. And now our food is being moved. So again, the tongue is going to elevate, the bolus is being pushed to the back, and then it's going to be pushed to the throat or the pharynx. And the coordination and execution of this is, yes, done by muscles and articulators like your teeth, your tongue, but it also involves some cranial nerves. So you have your trigeminal nerve, your facial nerve, and your hypoglossal nerve. So this is going to control your face movement and your tongue, like all those different articulators that are working together. So let's talk about this. This is important because we do want full control and range of motion when swallowing, because this is exactly what prevents going down the wrong pipe or leakage and spillage whenever you're chewing and swallowing, whether it's food or liquid. So all of these nerves are sending information to the different parts of your face in order for these actions to be completed correctly. Okay, next we get into our pharyngeal stage. So this is the third stage in the swallowing process. And now the bolus has reached the pharynx. And this is going to activate an involuntary swallowing action. So this means you do not have control over this process. Think of it like a switch on, and then it happens. So this specifically occurs within the swallowing center, which is the medulla. So that's where the information is being sent from. So here, the nasopharyngeal area is going to close off to prevent pressure within the nasal cavity. Again, as we're swallowing, different areas will be closed off, as we talked about with the nasal cavity and the lungs, in order to prevent fluid from going where it should not be going. And once swallowing has begun, the bolus, through contractions, so remember our constriction and release movement, within the mouth, pharynx, and esophagus, is going to begin to be pushed further into the pharynx and towards the esophagus. So specifically, you're going to use intrinsic and cricoarachnoid muscles of the larynx. So these muscles in specific are the cricothyroid, the posterior cricothyroid, and the thiarachnoid. These muscles are going to cause the larynx and vocal folds to move, and movement is very important because movement is what is moving the bolus down. The arachnoids will then tilt forward, and this is so that our esophagus can open and protect the lungs from food entering. After this, the suprahyoid muscles are going to contract in order for the food or the bolus to move from the pharynx into the esophagus. So here there is a lot of constriction and release going on, or things moving in certain places, because the goal is to move in the correct position, but also to move with the correct timing. So a little bit more about timing we'll go over in stage 4, our esophageal stage. So here, this is the last stage in the swallowing process. And our bolus has reached our esophagus. So the bolus is going to continue to move through peristalsis. And so this occurs at a slower rate than the pharyngeal stage. So here, because it is going to our stomach, this is around 3 to 4 centimeters per second. So that means that it's moving down 3 to 4 centimeters per second. And this might be seen a little bit faster in the pharyngeal stage just because it's first entering the throat or the pharynx. So the goal here is for your bolus to reach the stomach. And we know that this is complete when the bolus has passed the lower esophageal sphincter. So whenever this occurs, we know that the food is now in the stomach. And speaking a little bit more about the lower esophageal sphincter, um, it does remain contracted once this has passed in order to prevent regurgitation. So we do not want food that went down to have the chance to come back up, which is why it stays constricted. But don't get that confused. There is still constriction and a relaxed movement when it is passing through in order to make that process a little bit easier. And here we have two diagrams. So let's take a look at this one first. So this one kind of gives us an idea about specifically what is being used in our first two stages. So we have our hard and soft palate, our mouth, our tongue, our epiglottis. And then throughout the process, you're also going to use things like your lower and upper esophageal sphincters, your trachea, your larynx, your pharynx. And as you can see, the black area is a representation of food. It enters, it is being pushed back, and then we have some elevation, and then it goes to the pharynx, and then it will move down to the esophagus. So in these areas is when you will see the in and out movement in order to aid in the passage. Then we can take another look. So again, our first two stages are voluntary, which means that we have control. And here the bolus is being represented by the yellow coloring. So again, it is moving in a downward motion. It also gives us another idea of some things that are involved. Like in our first stage, it has our hard and soft palate once again, our oropharynx. And then when we move to our second stage, which is when the food will enter the pharynx, we have our superior, middle, inferior pharyngeal constrictors, lower and upper esophageal sphincters, our esophagus, our nasopharynx. And then when we get to our last stages, this is when it is moving into the esophagus. So you'll see like the opening of the larynx, your vocal folds are involved. So there is a lot of movement occurring, but these are to get a good idea and representation of where, specifically with these, you can see a little bit more of the anatomy behind it, where exactly the food is traveling. So here is a list of references that we used in order to complete this presentation. And thank you so much.